The wind hit Providence, Colorado at 3:17 p.m. on February 9, 1884. It did not arrive with a gentle warning. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of force and ice that slammed into the mining town from the north. The temperature, a brisk but manageable 10, plummeted 40 in less than 20 minutes. The sky, a placid gray moments before, turned into a churning horizontal chaos of white. Inside the mountain, Silas Garrett felt nothing but a faint high-pitched whistle as the wind found a tiny imperfection in the seal of his stout wooden door. He checked the thermometer he'd mounted on the interior stone wall. It read a steady 52. He tossed a single seasoned log into the small cast iron stove, not for heat, but for the cheerful light it would provide. His chestnut mare, Copper, shifted her weight in the adjoining stable, also carved from the living rock, her soft snort, one of utter contentment. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, it was just another Tuesday. Silas knew he had done the work. Now all he had to do was wait. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1882, Silas Garrett had been an object of curiosity, then pity, and finally outright ridicule. An orphan who had come west at 16, he'd spent the next 15 years not chasing gold, but learning the earth itself. He worked in the silver mines not as a blaster, but as a surveyor's assistant, then as a timberman, shoring up tunnels, and finally as a junior engineer. He learned the language of rock, the stoicism of granite, the treachery of shale, the secrets of thermal mass. He saw how even on the most brutal winter days, the temperature 50 feet inside a mine shaft never varied by more than a few degrees from its year-round average of 54. He watched timber supports, thick as a man's waist, groan and snap under the immense pressure of the mountain, while the rock itself remained unmoved, eternal. When he'd saved enough, $300, a small fortune earned through quiet frugality, he didn't buy a plot in town or a piece of flat pasture land. He went to the land office and spoke to Mayor Hutchins, a man whose ambition was only exceeded by his conventionality. Silas laid a map on the counter, his finger tapping a section of land 2 miles north of town that everyone considered worthless. It was a sheer granite bluff, a 200 feet tall rock face that faced south, overlooking a creek. Nothing could be built on it. Nothing could be grown on it. Mayor Hutchins peered over his spectacles. "That's the old Miller claim, son. It's solid rock. Nothing there but a cliff and some scrub pine. You can't build a cabin on a 60 slope." Silas nodded, his calm demeanor often mistaken for slowness. "I don't intend to build on it, Mayor." "I intend to build in it." The mayor blinked. "In it? Like a badger?" Silas pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a detailed drawing, a cross-section of the bluff. He had sketched out a main chamber 18 feet wide and 24 feet deep with a vated 10 feet ceiling. Next to it was a smaller chamber, a stable for his horse. A narrow flue for a stove was designed to follow a natural fissure in the rock up to the surface. He had calculated the tonnage of rock to be removed, the tools required, and the estimated time. It was the work of an engineer, not a madman. Mayor Hutchins stared at the drawing, a slow smile of condescending amusement spreading across his face. "Son," he said, patting Silas's shoulder, "it's 1882. We have sawmills. We build proper timber frame houses, civilized houses. We left the caves behind 1,000 years ago. What in God's name would possess you to live in a hole in the ground?" Silas's explanation was patient and technical, which only served to further alienate the practical-minded men in the land office. He spoke of geothermal insulation. The mountain, he explained, acts as a heat sink. In summer, it absorbs the sun's warmth, and in winter, it slowly releases it. A dwelling inside the rock would remain at a near constant temperature, requiring a fraction of the firewood needed for a conventional home. The south-facing entrance would capture the low winter sun, providing passive solar heat and light. The sheer mass of the rock would make it impervious to wind, snow load, and fire. "It's not a cave," he corrected gently. "It's a thermally regulated, structurally superior dwelling that uses the natural properties of the landscape." The Ute people built cliff dwellings on these same principles for centuries. They weren't primitive. They were intelligent. The mayor just shook his head. He sold Silas the 40-acre parcel for a pittance, $10, and the story was all over Providence by supper time. The quiet, solitary orphan boy, the one they called Silas, had finally lost his mind. He was going to live in a rock. The mockery began in earnest the day Silas arrived at his claim with a cart full of mining tools and his steady mare, Copper. Martin Fletcher, a rancher whose sprawling two-story house was the largest in the county, rode out to watch. Fletcher had spent over $4,000 on his home, a monument to his success, and the idea of a man choosing to live in a hole was a personal affront to his sense of progress. He watched as Silas used a star drill and a sledgehammer to begin boring the first blast hole. "What's the matter, Garrett?" Fletcher called out, his voice dripping with scorn. "Git," snorts, "tired of living above ground with the rest of us. Decided to join the prairie dogs." The name stuck. At the general store, men would ask Thomas Brennan, the owner, if he'd seen the badger that day. The children, picking up on their parents' derision, would chant it when he came to town for supplies. The project was christened Garrett's Burrow, and later, more simply, The Folly. Rebecca Walsh, the town school teacher and a woman who prided herself on enlightenment, used Silas as a cautionary tale in her lessons. She spoke of the march of civilization from caves to huts to the fine wooden homes they all enjoyed. Mr. Garrett, she explained to her pupils, represents a regression, a step backward into the darkness. We should pity him, not emulate him. Even Dr. Harrison Webb, a man of science, found it absurd. He cornered Silas outside the Mercantile one afternoon. "Silas, the man's lungs need fresh, circulating air."
"A damp cave is a breeding ground for consumption and rheumatism. You're inviting illness." Silas tried to explain that his design included a ventilation system with a fresh air intake near the floor and the stove flue drawing stale air out. "It won't be damp, doctor. The granite is not porous. It will be far drier than a log cabin with chinking that fails." The doctor just sighed and walked away, shaking his head. The town had made up its mind. Doing something so needlessly complicated and strange became known as pulling a Garrett. The work was brutal, methodical, and solitary. For 2 years, Silas Garrett labored. His days were a rhythm of steel on rock. He would drill a series of holes, carefully measure, and place small precise charges of dynamite, just enough to fracture the rock, not to obliterate it. The explosions were small, muffled coughs, not great roars. Then came the back-breaking work of clearing the rubble. He used a wheelbarrow and a sledgehammer, breaking larger chunks into manageable pieces. Copper, fitted with a special harness, would drag sleds loaded with stone out of the growing cavern and dump them near the creek bed, where Silas carefully arranged them to form a retaining wall. The townspeople would sometimes ride out on a Sunday, treating the construction site as a form of local entertainment. They watched him stripped to the waist in the summer sun, muscles corded and lean, his face perpetually smudged with rock dust. They saw a man engaged in what they believed to be pointless, insane labor. He never acknowledged their jeers. He simply worked. He was meticulous. He snorts kept a journal noting his progress. June 12, 1882, advanced the main chamber by 2 feet. Total depth, now 8 feet. Used for charges. Copper hauled an estimated 3 tons of rubble. He lined the entrance with a heavy timber frame. 12 pine beams he traded for with a logger, creating a 20-foot-long, 8-foot-wide entryway that acted as an airlock. This, he knew, was the crucial buffer zone between the outside world and his stable inner climate. Inside, the walls were not left rough. He spent 4 months smoothing them with a hammer and chisel, not for aesthetics, but because smooth walls would prevent moisture from collecting and would reflect light more evenly. He carved out niches for shelves, a bed platform, and a workbench. The stable for Copper was a masterpiece of equine engineering, with a sloped floor for drainage and a manger carved from the same living stone. The total cost of his materials, including the $22 cast iron stove, the dynamite, the drill bits, and the timber, came to $187. Martin Fletcher spent more than that on the glass for his parlor windows. By the fall of 1883, the dwelling was complete. He built a thick, insulated wooden door and fitted it into the timber frame. He moved in his few possessions: a cot, a table, 2 chairs, his books on geology and engineering, and his father's old rifle. The townspeople placed bets in the saloon on how long he would last. The consensus was that he'd be begging for a room at the boarding house by the first major snowstorm. One winter, they all agreed. That's all it would take to cure him of his folly. But the first winter was mild, and Silas thrived. His need for firewood was astonishingly low. He burned less than a cord of wood the entire season, while his neighbors in their drafty cabins burned 5 or 6. In the summer of '83, when temperatures soared into the 9 south, the townspeople stayed. Inside Garrett's burrow, the temperature never rose above 65 degrees. He was cool, comfortable, and content. His quiet success was, in some ways, more irritating to the town than his perceived madness had been. They stopped riding out to mock him. His quiet competence had taken the fun out of it. "Let them watch," Silas would say to Copper, as he groomed her in the cool, stone-walled stable. "Time will tell." The signs began on February 8, 1884. Silas, with his deep understanding of the natural world, noticed them immediately. The air grew heavy, carrying a strange metallic scent. The birds, the hardy winter finches and jays, vanished completely. He saw a herd of elk moving down from the high country with a desperate urgency he had never witnessed before. That evening, the barometer on his wall plunged. He tapped it, but the needle didn't budge. It was not a malfunction. He spent the next day making final preparations. He brought in an extra week's worth of hay for Copper. He stacked his entire winter's wood supply, a pitifully small pile by town standards, just inside the entrance. He checked the seal on his door and packed the tiny remaining gaps with oiled canvas. He filled 4 large barrels with fresh water from the creek, knowing it would soon be inaccessible. He considered riding to town to warn them, but he knew how it would be received. The mad caveman predicting doom. They would laugh him out of the saloon. His warnings would be just another part of the joke. Being called crazy is a small price to pay for being alive, he thought, but maybe it's too high a price for trying to save those who call you crazy. He stayed put. The blizzard, when it came, was a thing of mythic violence. The locals would later call it the White Death. The snow didn't fall, it flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of ice crystals driven by a 70 miles per hour wind. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm in minutes, and then to 0. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar, like 1,000 freight trains passing at once. It was a storm that didn't just cover the world, it erased it. For the first 24 hours in Providence, it was a struggle. For the next 24, it was a crisis. By the 3rd day, it was a catastrophe. The fine timber frame houses the town was so proud of proved to be little more than glorified shacks against the storm's fury. The wind forced snow through every crack and crevice. The cold was a physical entity, leaching warmth from the very bones of the buildings. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat was whipped away as fast as it was generated. Martin Fletcher's grand house, with its many windows, was an icebox. He and his family burned through a month's worth of wood in 2 days, just to keep from freezing. On the 4th day, the first roof collapsed. Thomas Brennan, the store owner, heard the groaning of his timbers give way to a deafening crack. An avalanche of snow 12 feet deep on his roof plunged into his living space, extinguishing the fire and burying his furniture. He and his family barely escaped to a back room. Chimneys became blocked with impacted snow and ice, filling houses with smoke. Doors were frozen shut or buried under drifts that reached the eaves. The town of Providence was being dismantled house by house. Inside Garrettsboro, life continued in serene, insulated comfort. The temperature inside the main chamber never dropped below 50, even when the fire in the stove was out. The roar of the blizzard was a distant, muted hum, a reminder of a world that no longer concerned him. He read his geology books by lantern light, tended to copper, and ate his simple meals. He used 2 logs a day, one in the morning to boil coffee and one in the evening to heat his stew. He was safe. He was warm. He was, as he had always been, alone. The first arrival came on the evening of the 5th day. It was not a knock, but a frantic, desperate pounding. Silas opened the heavy door to a blast of Arctic air, and a figure so caked in ice, it was barely human. It was Dr. Harrison Webb. He collapsed into the entryway, gasping, his face a mask of frozen terror. "My wife," he choked out, his words ragged. "She has pneumonia. Our house? The fire is almost out. We've burned the furniture. We will freeze before morning. Please." Silas didn't hesitate. He helped the doctor inside, sat him by the stove, and gave him a cup of hot coffee. Then he put on his heaviest coat, grabbed a coil of rope, and followed the doctor back out into the maelstrom. It took them an hour to travel the 200 yd to the doctor's house, a journey that should have taken 2 minutes. They half-carried the doctor's delirious wife back to the burrow, a sanctuary of warmth and stillness in the heart of the howling chaos. They were the first, they were not the last. Word seemed to spread on the wind itself. The next morning, it was Thomas Brennan and his family, their faces frostbitten, their eyes wide with disbelief at the calm warmth inside the stone walls. They had seen the faint wisp of smoke from Silas's flue pipe, the only one in the entire area not blocked by snow, and had stumbled toward it as their last hope. By the 7th day, the procession was constant. One by one, family by family, they came. The very people who had mocked him, who had called him a badger and a fool, now fought their way through the blizzard to the door of his folly. They arrived half-frozen, humbled, their pride scoured away by the brutal, indifferent wind. Silas welcomed them all. He shared his food, his water, and his warmth, never once mentioning their past ridicule. There was no room for gloating, only survival. The main chamber became a makeshift infirmary and dormitory. 27 souls, plus a horse, sheltered within the mountain's embrace. The last to arrive was Mayor Hutchkins, accompanied by a nearly frozen Martin Fletcher. The roof on Fletcher's magnificent $4,000 ranch house had finally given way, the weight of the snow smashing it like a child's toy. They had barely escaped. Hutchkins, his face pale and his fine suit ruined, stood in the center of the chamber, looking at the faces of his townsfolk, safe, warm, and alive. And then at Silas. "We called your work a folly," the mayor said, his voice cracking. This folly has saved the lives of 27 people." Silas simply nodded and handed him a blanket. "That doesn't matter now. You're safe. That's what matters." The storm raged for 2 more days. In total, 9 days of unrelenting fury. When it finally broke, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The survivors emerged from Garrettsboro into a world transformed, a landscape of alien white sculptures. The devastation in Providence was absolute. 14 people were dead. Dozens more had severe frostbite. Of the 80 structures in the town, more than half were damaged beyond repair. A week later, after the dead had been buried and the immediate recovery had begun, Mayor Hutchkins called a town meeting in the shell of the ruined church. He asked Silas Garrett to stand before the assembled survivors. "I owe you an apology," Hutchkins said, his voice clear and steady, echoing in the cold air. "We all do. I called you animalized for wanting to live in a rock. I was wrong. We built our homes with pride and the wind took them. You built yours with wisdom and it sheltered us. I called you foolish, but you were the only one who built for the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. You were right. God help me. You were right. Martin Fletcher stood up. My ranch is gone, but I have money in the bank in Denver. I'll pay to have more of these shelters built for anyone who needs one. He turned to Silas. If you'll teach us. Silas, Garrett, the orphan boy, the badger, the fool, stood before them and simply said, "Of course." The next year, the hillsides around Providence began to change. Using Silas's techniques and Fletcher's funding, the townspeople began carving new dwellings into the rock. They were not just for emergencies. They became primary homes. Dr. Webb documented Silas's methods, sending detailed letters to engineers at the Colorado School of Mines. The principles of geothermal construction, long understood by ancient peoples, were rediscovered. By the winter of 1886, 11 families in Providence lived in homes carved from stone. The term pulling a garret was still used, but now it meant doing something with uncommon foresight and intelligence. Silas Garrett lived in his burrow for the rest of his life. He never married, but he was never again alone. He became the town's most respected elder, a quiet man whose wisdom was sought on all matters of building and survival. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1918 at the age of 69. The entire town and people from 3 counties attended his funeral. He was buried on the bluff above his home, a simple stone marker overlooking the valley. Today, Garrettsboro is a protected historical site. The town of Providence survived and eventually thrived, its unique stone architecture becoming a point of interest. Engineers and architects still visit to study the elegant simplicity of his design. At the entrance to the dwelling, bolted to the heavy timber frame he installed over a century ago, is a bronze plaque. It was placed there in 1920 by the townspeople he saved. It reads, "Silas Garrett, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom. When civilization faltered, the mountain endured. He taught us that the strongest shelter is not built against nature, but within it. In this rock he saved 27 souls and the future of our town." Beside him stood his faithful horse, Copper, the first life saved by this sanctuary. The rock still stands as rocks do. The winds still scour the high plains in winter, and the snow still fall. But the lesson remains, carved not just into the granite of the mountain, but into the memory of the people. Preparation is not paranoia. It is the highest form of respect for a world that is older, stronger, and far less forgiving than human pride. Subscribe for more, chilling content.